they may have to poke around as they are not necessarily testifying in alphabetical order. Real quick before I forget, Monday, apparently the weather does not look too good. We'll find out what the situation is. We do have budget hearings for the Kansas Corporation Commission and for CURB Monday. Just anybody listening in or anybody in the audience, pay attention in case we do have to make adjustments.
I thought you were going to just tell us what the weather was going to be, Mr. Chairman.
It was 4 to 6 inches here and 8 to 10 or 11 in Wichita. So on Sunday into Monday, so it's a little ugly. So we'll see if the storm shifts or what ends up happening, but it's going to be awfully cold. So hopefully we won't have to adjust the schedule, but you never know. Temperature's going to be in the single digits. Yeah, that's a big problem. So high of around 7. Yeah, exactly. So we may have to make adjustments depending on the situation there. Just a quick overview. Okay, today we are going to be hearing Senate Bill 81. Unfortunately, we had to carry that over from yesterday. And we've got a number of conferees, starting off with Paul Snyder from Kansas Industrial Consumers Group. Oh yeah, we need to give a reviser's overview first. So we'll turn the floor over to Mr. Sterling. Matt?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, committee. Senate Bill 81 would amend KSA 66-117B concerning reports by the Kansas Corporation Commission to the legislature. Under current law, the KCC annually reports to the legislature about any changed rate, any changed rule or regulation pertaining to the service or the rates of public utilities and common carriers. So Senate Bill 81 would require the KCC to also report to the legislature on the average residential, commercial, and industrial electric rates of electric public utilities in Kansas, and then in comparison to that average residential, commercial, and industrial rates of electric utilities from the surrounding states in the region. The reports would be required to contain certain financial, statistical, and narrative information about each utility's average rates. The report would not include information regarding any municipal or cooperative electric public utility that are exempt from KCC jurisdiction. Happy to try to answer questions the committee may have.
Thank you, Matt. Committee, any questions for Mr. Sterling? Seeing none, I also note that the fiscal note on this would have no effect on the agency unless a deeper dive were required. Agency indicates that if a deeper analysis of electric rates was required by the legislature, the cost would be approximately $50,000. So what we're requesting, at least in this bill, would apparently have no effect on the fiscal operations of KCC. So with that, our first oral conferee is Paul Snyder, Kansas Industrial Consumers Group. Paul, you have the floor, sir.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Paul Snyder. I am representing the Kansas Industrial Consumers Group and Kansans for Lower Electric Rates. Appreciate the opportunity to be here to talk a little bit about electric rates. So that's been a topic certainly for this committee the last couple of days and a little bit last week. But the debate or conversation on that actually goes back a couple of years, starting in 2018. The Senate passed a resolution, I think with all but 2 members' support, asking the KCC to take action on our high electric rates, and if they can't, to come back and talk to the legislature about what tools they need. In 2019, the Senate nearly unanimously, or maybe unanimously, passed Senate Bill 69, which provided 2 different rate studies, or rate study broken up into 2 different reports, I suppose I should say. And then last year, we worked on a bill that would eliminate the state income tax for utilities so that those savings could be passed on to consumers. So there's been lots of conversations. Evergy now acknowledges that their rates are high. I don't think that's much of a debate. Both this week and last week, Evergy and the KCC both acknowledged that bills have gone down in Kansas. That is because of some federal tax cuts, the 2017 Trump tax cuts that got implemented and pushed out. Some of it is a timing delay that moved those back a little bit. Some of them hit last year. And also merger-related bill credits. And so that, in general, is a good thing. We're not overly concerned about things that happened in the past or last year. The fact remains, Evergy rates are still the highest of our neighboring states. What we are concerned about is what's coming. We've got a transmission delivery charge increase of roughly $30 million or more coming on April 1st. Chuck talked about the STP Tuesday, I guess. My group, probably not surprisingly, has a different interpretation of what that's going to mean to rates. We expect very significant rate increases coming. So that's really why we're here. This bill, what Senate Bill 81 does, is simply ask the KCC to start reporting what our rates are compared to other states so that we can start to measure, are we making progress? Are we closing that gap between our rates and rates in Oklahoma, Iowa, Missouri, whatever? Or are we losing ground? So that's really all this does. There is an existing report that comes to you. We're just asking for that to be amended slightly to include this information. The chairman mentioned there is no fiscal note. And then included in my testimony, there are several charts about rates done by, a couple of them are from us. One is by London Economics, one is by the U.S. Chamber. As Chuck or others will point out, there are various charts like this out there. I think what we're asking is a little more detailed than what's here, but certainly not exhaustive by any means, and the KCC has all that information available. So with that, when we get to the appropriate time, I would encourage your support on this bill, and I will be happy to take questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you, Mr. Snyder. I think Jason Watkins, by the way, was unable to attend. He was supposed to provide oral written testimony, but was unable to be here. We also have some other written proponent testimony from Elizabeth Patton from Americans for Prosperity, Eric Stafford, Kansas Chamber, Randy Stuckey of the Kansas Grain and Feed. I think what I'm going to do is go ahead and take the oral neutral testimony and then open it up to questions from the committee so that we can kind of hear all sides of this before we open it up to questions. So our first conferee batting for Leslie Kaufman will be Doug Shepard of the Kansas Electric Cooperatives. Doug?
Morning or afternoon, Mr. Chairman, committee. Yeah, I am not Leslie Kaufman. I'm Doug Shepard with Kansas Electric Cooperatives. Leslie was double booked on another hearing that carried over, so I'm going to step in and give her testimony. So I'll be representing, I'm giving neutral testimony on behalf of Kansas Electric Cooperatives and the Kansas Municipal Utilities. We are both organizations, are associations representing two of the three different sectors in the electric utility industry in the state. The KEC represents the electric cooperatives. We've got 27 distribution co-ops in the state and 3 generation and transmission co-ops that operate in the state. Our members cover about 75 to 80% of the land mass in the state in 103 of the 105 counties in Kansas. Kansas Municipal Utilities, they have 186 member utilities that not only electric, but gas, water, wastewater, stormwater, and telecommunications. Their membership ranges from the large, from a Board of Public Utilities down to small utilities that might represent 100 consumers. Over the years, both of our organizations have strived to engage our memberships in communicating concerns about energy topics, and one of them has been electric rates. Over the last couple of years, that's been a topic of conversation. We were supportive of Senate Bill 69 and the study of electric rates, and participated in that process. And as such, even though this bill doesn't apply to either one of our membership utilities, in the interest of furthering public discourse, we wanted to offer a couple of things for the committee's consideration as you look at this bill. One of the first things is, this study, these types of studies are done several times by different organizations, and we question whether it needed to be done again by a state agency, federal agency, the Energy Information Administration prepares these studies on an annual basis, and there are a number of organizations that do that. Secondly, just point out that there may be opportunities for the way that the bill is written, asking for financial and statistical information, that may be a way to open up a way to get some confidential information. If you think back in the AECOM study, there was a big issue about some of the data that was reported and what was redacted and couldn't be reported. And so just want to be mindful that some of the stuff that was asked for may not be public information. The third issue is the bill is not really specific about which states are going to be compared. You know, besides the 4 neighboring states, there's 5 other states, and we're not sure how that will be picked. And you know, it depends on how you pick those states, will depend on how Kansas ranks among those. And so the question is, you know, will this be left to the KCC? Will they have to open up a docket to determine which states will be included? Is it left to staff? There are a couple of other things that you need to consider. Whether you look at states that are within the SPP that all have the same or similar generation mix that they're looking at, which states are included in which EPA region, which can impact a lot of the cost of a utility. And so, you know, as you go forward state or year after year, how that changes and how that comparison changes is something to consider. The other thing that we want to point out is, you know, over the last couple of years, the metric that's been used is just the average price of electricity. And just on its own, that's kind of, can be misleading, or it could be twisted to position, point out one position or the other. There are a number of reasons that were pointed out in the legislative studies why rates vary from state to state, everything from population, consumer density, the generation mix, percent of industrial load versus residential. So a lot of those things can vary. So we would encourage you to consider, if you were to move forward on this, in providing some more context in more than just the average price of electricity. And then the last thing, I guess, the revisor spoke to a little bit, that it doesn't sound like there's a large fiscal note, but if there were a deeper dive, one of the questions is, you know, how's that going to be paid? Is that going to be assessed to the utilities that we're already looking at what their rates are compared to other states? So that's not an exhaustive list, but it's just a few things to think about. And I appreciate the opportunity to testify here today. And when you're ready, we'll be ready to stand for questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shepherd. Next up, Chuck. I don't see Chuck. Laura, are you? Oh, Chuck's WebEx. Chuck Casely from Evergy. He's coming out. I didn't see the WebEx. Go ahead, Chuck.
Mr. Chairman, Madam Ranking Member, thanks for having me back today, although this time remotely. Appreciate the opportunity to testify on this bill. Evergy is officially neutral on this bill and highly skeptical of Mr. Snyder's testimony. We'll elaborate on that here in just a second. Look, we are all for transparency, and over the last 4 years, we supported the study legislation that was passed by this body. We supported the tax cut legislation that was supported by this body. And we also added on to that, with the help of the former chair of this committee, an economic development rates bill that is already paying dividends in terms of attracting more load and business to the state. So all of the things with which Mr. Snyder referred to from a historical perspective are things that Evergy has supported and helped pass in this body, and we believe in transparency. I think it goes without saying, I think most people here know, we are probably one of the most transparent and heavily scrutinized industries in the United States. If we want to do anything, if we want to change our rates up or down, if we want to make investments, if we want just about anything we would like to do with customers, we have to go before the Kansas Corporation Commission. And many times, whether it's a rate case or the current ongoing STP docket, disclose thousands of pages of information, the vast majority of which is public, and the few pieces of information that are not are held confidentially so that the commission and all the interveners can see them, but also this body if you would like to see it as well. I think my point is we are very, very supportive of transparency, but we think maybe perhaps this bill is something that is a little bit redundant. If you used your cell phone, you can very easily Google and get all of the information that is being asked to be put into state law, literally in a fraction of a second. I actually did that in front of the House Utilities Committee earlier this week. I actually Googled it in front of them and said, if you want information from the Energy Information Administration, EPRI, EEI, and a dozen different consultants, it's all available and very easy to digest. So one wonders why we need to put into state statute and pass a state statute to do that. But further, I would also suggest that if you ask a member of the KCC staff, I am sure just being responsive to this committee, they would again be very willing to do it. Finally, with respect to the bill, I think we are very happy to have this passed into law if that's what the will of the body is. We do think, though, like the co-ops and the municipal utilities, that rate comparators by a kilowatt hour are just some of the things that the committee should look at with respect to competitiveness when it comes to energy. And so if this bill is worked, and whether in this committee and or out on the floor, we will have some amendments to include additional things that we think would form a broader, better, fuller, more transparent picture. Just a couple of remarks in closing. It's always interesting when somebody paraphrases you in front of a body. I do not admit that our rates are high. I believe that our rates are competitive, and I believe that whether you're looking at bills or whether you're looking at kilowatt hours and how you're dividing that, you can get different rankings. I believe that the KCC has presented to this group and shown how that can be showed a number of different ways. Without debating that today, though, what I would say is rate competitiveness is something that is critically important to Evergy. It is mentioned throughout all of the documentation in our STP, and something we believe wholeheartedly the STP will help make progress in the state. Secondly, we heard a little bit about the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act and its impact on our rates. Just so we know, of the $315 million we are down in our rates since June of 2015, that accounts for less than 25% of the impact. The vast majority has come through cuts in operations, merger credits, and rate reductions as a result of the merger, something that I would add, the Kansas Industrial Council opposed not once, but twice. And finally, I would just say that with respect to the transmission charge that was referred to, yes, it is scheduled to go up later this year. And the rate increase is going to be not insignificant for the transmission delivery charge, or the TDC. But I would point out that out of the last 5 times it's been adjusted, 4 of those times it will have gone down. And net, since Evergy became a company, we are down overall on the TDC, and we are down overall in rates by still a net of more than $280 million. Again, we are very happy to have increased transparency, and anything this committee or the body of the legislature would like, we will prepare and give to them at any time. We just wonder whether mandating in state law very specific things in a report that's already mandated is necessary. Thank you very much, and I'd be happy to take questions at any time.
Chuck, and our final conferee via WebEx is Justin Grady of the Kansas Corporation Commission. Justin?
Yes, good afternoon, Chair Thompson, members of the committee. I'm Justin Grady. I'm Chief of Revenue Requirements, Cost of Service, and Finance for the KCC. I work in the Utilities Division. My written testimony on this bill, on proposed bill, Senate Bill 81, is short, so I'll make my verbal comments succinct. We certainly don't oppose the request. If it's the will of the legislature to have access to this information on an annual basis, we stand ready and willing to do that. As the committee's aware, last Thursday, I gave a presentation to the committee that went through most of the type of information that would be requested to be provided in an annual report. But much like some of the other conferees, we're just not sure that it's necessary to change the law in order to be assured access to that information. Ultimately, the information is publicly available. It's easily accessible. Many of the conferees have mentioned most of the data comes from the Energy Information Administration. It's on their website. What I mentioned last Thursday to the committee is that if you're going to look at the information, it is important to look at not the all-in rate for the state of Kansas, but split it out. Look at it in terms of residential, commercial, and industrial rates separately. In terms of the 9 states that the information calls for, or that the proposed bill calls for, those 9 states were the same 9 states that were listed in my presentation last Thursday. They are the states that the London Economics LEI in the first phase of the rate study evaluated. And so we could, if the committee desires to move the bill forward, we could certainly identify those states so that there's no ambiguity there. But at the end of the day, we just aren't, if we're neutral on the bill because we're not sure that it's necessary to change the law to have access to this information, but we certainly would be willing to provide it and stand ready to comply with the will of the body. And if it's just an annual request to come down and present the information, we'll certainly be willing to do that. So with that, I will, that's the end of prepared remarks, I guess. And so I'd certainly be willing to answer any questions at the appropriate time. Thank you for the opportunity to appear virtually this afternoon.
All right, thank you, Justin. We don't have any listed opponent testimony, and I don't know if there's any in the room, anyone here? Seeing none, I think what we will do is open up to the committee for questions. Does anyone have any? Senator Corson.
Well, I do sort of just picking up on kind of what Doug or Mr. Shepard and Mr. Grady talked about. I do wonder if we do want to move forward with this, if we would want to go, and I would sort of open it up to the will of the committee, if we wanted to specify more details about rates, if we wanted to break it down in a certain way, if we wanted to have an agreed upon 9 states that would be looked at. Because it seems like you don't want to pass this and then end up fighting about whether the right states were in it and whether it's reliable because we did or didn't look at the right states. You know, it's sort of that saying there's, 3 things. There's lies, damn lies, and statistics. So I just wonder if we would want to spell out more specifically what we would want included so we didn't later end up in a point where people on one side or the other side were quibbling over we would have had a different result if we would have looked at different states, or the information's misleading because we didn't break it down by residential and industrial. I just kind of throw that out there because I picked up on that when Mr. Shepard testified. Thank you.
Thanks, Senator Corson. I have a question for Mr. Snyder, kind of along those lines. Could we just, as a committee, request some version of this without putting it into statute? Have KCC do this?
I think that's certainly a direction to go. Mr. Grady mentioned that just now and was in his written testimony. And as Mr. Casely said, I think the KCC will always be responsive to what this committee wants. Our goal at the end of the day is that legislators have access to this information in a consistent, uniform standpoint year to year, because the charts that we put together may be different than the ones Evergy puts together. If you Google, and as Mr. Casely said, you may get 600 responses. They're all going to be formatted different ways. So we do think that there's great value in having a consistent report that you all have access to be able to measure this, whether that's done through legislation or a bill. I think we can leave to the body. I will, I guess in response to Senator Corson, our plan with this was to leave discretion to the KCC. Certainly understand, appreciate everyone's perspective. Maybe we should have tied that down and listed specifically states and other things. It is listed that we are looking for a breakdown of residential, commercial, and industrial, because we do think that's, you know, more valuable than just the overall average, blended average.
Committee, any questions? Senator Olson.
Yeah, I don't know, myself, if we're gonna do it, I'd rather be statute so we can debate it here and see if we really need it. I think if we leave it to interpretation, then it's up to one or two people to make that decision. I don't think that's what we're sent here for, but if we're gonna look at things, one of the things I would like to look at, you know, the rate concessions that have been made over the years to certain groups, like your group, by its users, over the last several rate hearings, that have been made. So, I mean, if we're gonna start, you know, picking groups, that's probably the one I'd want at the top of my list, because I'm trying to make sure, you know, business A and business B is getting charged the same amount. So that's my comment.
Senator Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think my question is, I understand the bill is asking for average residential, commercial, and industrial electric rates. I'm wondering how much variation there is between investor-owned utilities, municipally owned utilities, electric co-ops, and whether we lose the understanding of that difference if we just ask for an average rate. And that would probably be the Kansas Corporation Commission to answer that.
Justin, do you have an answer for us?
Well, I can certainly try.
Oh, I'm sorry, and identify yourself. I forget to do that. And anybody WebEx or coming up, just remember to identify yourself so the folks watching, or not watching, I'm used to TV, listening at home can tell who's talking. Justin, turn it back over.
Yeah, thank you, Senator. This is Justin Grady again with the KCC. Senator Francisco, that's a good question. There certainly can be especially amongst individual utilities within the state, there certainly is can be a pretty significant disparity between investor-owned utilities and cooperative utilities and municipal utilities. You know, I would point the committee back to the detailed information that I presented to this committee last Thursday, in terms of how the view can be different when you look at the all-in rate, for instance, versus looking at an Evergy rate. You know, an Evergy average residential rate compared to the state of Kansas average residential rate are two different things. And so the EIA data is presented in a significant amount of detail. And so, Senator Francisco, I know you're familiar with the SPP website. If you ever spend much time in there, you realize that there is literally no end that's available on that website. And the EIA website's very similar. So we can slice and dice the information in any fashion that the committee pleases. We could exclude completely cooperatives. We could try to exclude municipalities. Now, I will say that the easiest data to pull is the all-in, all consumer rate across the state of Kansas, as well as the average residential rate, the average commercial, and the average industrial rate. That's the information that I could pull in, 15 minutes. But if you start to slice it and present it more in a more customized fashion, that can take a little more time. But that certainly doesn't mean that we can't do that. But so we're open, we're flexible.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, Mr. Grady, I was very impressed with the information that you were able to provide us on those rates. I'm wondering if you might have some recommendations, if you were given a little time to think of those, of what a report might be for this committee for the next 3 years. That would be consistent data, that would include these averages and some other information. And then I think we will be meeting over this year and the next 3 years. And at that time, we might say, has this information been useful? Is it something we want other legislators to continue to have? I think, one of my concerns is, I used to get paid a lot at the University of Kansas for putting together a report that I think Strom Thurmond had asked for 30 years ago, and it was a requirement in it was a federal requirement, and we don't know that anybody looked at it, but no one in Congress asked for that report to stop. So anyways, a few comments.
Senator Olson.
Okay,
I was asking at the beginning of that if Mr. Grady would help us with identifying some consistent information that the KCC could provide each year to this committee.
Yeah, Mr. Grady, any guidance on that? Or obviously, let me add to that question. We don't want to have to go to the deep dive and add a fiscal note to this. So, where does the shallow dive end and the deep dive begin? I think that's probably a succinct way to put it.
Yeah, so this is Justin Grady again. Thank you. So we certainly could help the committee define the edges of the difference between the deep dive and the shallow dive in terms of for instance, some of Mr. Casely's recommendations in his testimony, while what Mr. Casely is trying to get across is that there honestly is not a lot of information value that's gained by looking at how rates in one state compare to the next. I mean, you need to look at a few other things. You need to look at average monthly bills, and that just scratches the surface. I mean, that will tell you on a purely volumetric basis what is the cost of electricity between one state and the next. But it doesn't come close to explaining and understanding the drivers behind what truly influences those. So when we did our rate study in 2019, the KCC, my boss and I, Jeff McClanahan and I, spent literally hundreds of hours putting that together. Okay, and when we presented it to the committee, it took 2 days, and there is a deep analytical evaluation of what the drivers were for Evergy's rates. There's a deep evaluation of what the drivers were for each of the surrounding 23 utilities in 9 different states. And that's the kind of thing that we couldn't do every year because we need to regulate utilities, not just do those kind of studies every year. And that's the kind of evaluation where the fiscal note comes in, and some of the type of information that Mr. Casely requests, to his credit, is saying, well, let's not just look at what the rates are. Let's try to understand why they're different. But that's a much deeper dive. That's a comprehensive process. So I know that was a longer answer probably than the senator requested, but we're certainly willing to sit down and try to if it's the will of the body to move this forward, we're certainly willing to sit down and discuss as part of a stakeholder group how to do it correctly and tighten it up and make sure that it's what people are looking for, and that it's not going to be an unwieldy process that lasts for 30 years when people are only really, really interested in it for the next 4 or 5 years or whatever.
Thank you, Justin. Senator Olson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think a lot goes into that. First start is the fuel mix. If your gas prices are fluctuating, just as we're seeing at the pump, our natural gas prices are going to fluctuate too. Our cost of fuel is going to fluctuate. You know, how many people are served? I mean, you're comparing to Missouri or some of them states that are more populated per square mile or more populated areas where you have, you know, it's going to cost more to serve areas that are not as populated. There's going to be, states do things different on the exemption of cities and municipalities, what's exempt, what's not. And I think you're going to have so many variables, you're going to waste millions of dollars and find out nothing. That's what's going to happen. The fact is, we know McPherson is the cheapest municipal in the state. Of course, they just serve a small area. You know, the co-ops, they serve a great geographical area that nobody wanted to serve for a long time. And they put a lot of lines in, a lot of infrastructure. They've got a mix. You know, for example, how are you going to figure out how much wind? You're just going to put on an average day, not an actual day. And so you're not going to be able to figure how much, you know, wind's producing, how much natural gas. It's just going to be averages. And then you're going to take them averages. Have we looked at everybody's rates to see if there's concessions in them rates for certain business groups? I mean, you're going to sit here and play around with this and spend millions of dollars and find out we've got a really good system that has been modernized. We're ahead of a lot of the states around us. But I think without taking a dive to know what gas is in all the 8 states around us, this year, next year, year after, how much wind they're producing, how many, you know, per square mile, per population that they're serving, taking out all them tax mix, I don't think there's any way to really figure out, you know, if power is really cheaper in Missouri than Kansas or not out of Evergy's area. I mean, what if one utility has a tax exemption, one doesn't? I mean, are you treating them the same?
Senator Hawk.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I actually like the idea behind this bill in terms of us having data, but it occurs to me having data and then making decisions about that data is sort of the reason for having it. And I think the senator from Johnson raised some important points, but it's just a comment. It seems to me what we're lacking is we don't have a state energy plan. And that's probably something that we ought to be looking at as a step. And then we do have an energy office that's part of the KCC, and yet it's separate. But those, I sort of challenge our committee to say, if we need data, and I think we all kind of got on notice that we recognize that certainly in certain areas, our electric rates were higher than any of us wanted them to be. But that maybe is the easiest thing to look at. But I stress that I think we need to look just a little bit further down. And I'm not sure how we go about that. And I think maybe those 2 energy studies, if we get a chance sometime this year to hear those, might give us some insight of how we might go about that. Or maybe we need to study that as a potential solution that might get us to some things that would help our businesses, our economy, and our residential customers. Thank you.
Senator Olson?
You know, I keep hearing we don't have an energy plan. It's because we just completed it. I think the 20 by 2020 was the energy plan to become 20% green energy. We changed that from a mandate to a goal. We hit it. We're past it. This is just to drive to a new energy plan. I mean, we hear people talk all the time that the transmission has been one of the reasons why the rates have went up because of the green energy plan we had before. I supported it. I think it was the right direction. But I'm not for driving us deeper down to have another energy plan like we just got rid of. I think once we got rid of the energy plan, spurred more investment in Kansas and green wind. I don't know. That's just, I feel like by having this new plan, we're trying to go back and push towards some, I don't know, 40% green energy by such and such date. I mean, that's the kind of plan. I just don't think that's going to be good for Kansas. I don't think it's going to be good for the businesses. I think it'll cause more transmission to be built, but I could be wrong.
Mr. Chair, I love it when we get to debate a little bit here, Senator Olson. We had a great debate yesterday about what to do with electric vehicles. I see a statewide energy plan being a lot more comprehensive than just 40% or 20%. There are a whole lot of issues since I've been on this committee we deal with that I think do need some thought. They need professional input, they need data, and then they need policy input. And so I think that's one way we might consider getting at this whole issue of what do we want Kansas to look like as we look 10, 15, 20, 30, 40, 50 years down the road. And the world is changing. So what was good that I'm proud that we did with our RPS and some of the goals we set, I don't know that those are the best model for us long-term down the road. So good debate. Thank you.
I think the market's going to drive it. I think it's drove it way past 20%. And I think we need to just let the market drive it the rest of the way. And on the car deal, I went by Quick Trip last night, and I'm still not convinced that model's going to work. I'm almost 100% sure. I just look at all the cars in Quick Trip and driving up and down the street going, and I don't see that model working unless you take more ground up.
Let's get back on the bill. I think we got far afield here. Senator Fagg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to get in this debate here too. My question is the KCC job. They have a job, and I think they do a lot of this probably. And so they do their job, and then we have to take this, and the more people get going, and from my background, when I see would contain financial, statistical, and narrative information, that's a lot of work. Now, the question is, what are you going to do with that work? And I think the KCC gets that information. It's probably public. I don't know, but I would say that's public information. So I would envision it would be nice to have a one-page report that breaks this out. And then if we have a problem with something we're seeing there, then we could ask them for more, and I think they'd be happy to do it. So that's just my little input to this.
I will kind of concur with that. I maybe rather than trying to push this legislation right now, and I'll ask the committee what its will is perhaps I could work with Mr. Snyder, talk with the KCC, come up with some kind of a one-page type overview that they think would be useful for this committee and maybe even the public, and then report back before we advance this legislation any further. And I'd open that that question to the will of the committee. Senator Francisco?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would agree with that, and then, also see if just getting that report for this committee for the next 3 years, see if we do anything with it.
Any other discussion? Seeing none, I think what we'll do is I will get with Mr. Snyder, Mr. Fisher, all the folks involved, and see if we can figure out something. Maybe we can. I don't know. And then we'll bring it back to the committee for consideration and go from there rather than try to work this bill right now. If everyone's in agreement with that, I think we're probably done for the day. And we're going to do minutes next week. I think, yeah, we've got a few more. We're just going to blast them out to you so everybody has a chance to look at the minutes. We'll do that next week. And again, stay tuned, everybody, for Monday. We'll see what the weather does to us, and we'll see how the roads are and go from there. With that, I believe we are adjourned.